Ashed by the bankers. I finally have some time to do this. I've been so busy with my job and I got a little sick last week, and anyway, no excuses. Here we go. The events described in this book started in the summer of 1981. I, Byron Dale, was a rancher in the heartland of South Dakota. I spent all my time working hard and trying to manage my ranch in a manner that would bring the highest productivity and profit possible. My wife Judy and I were married in '62 and began our life together on the ranch. Over the years, our marriage had developed into a real working partnership. Judy took an H&R Block income tax course and also learned from a CPA until she developed into a very efficient bookkeeper. I, on the other hand, had studied farm management and feed ration analysis. Alright, so together with our two boys, Brad and Corey, we ran a very efficient ranch. A couple of years preceding 1981, my brother, who was a high school teacher in Lemond, South Dakota, he became an ordained minister, was presented with quite a problem. He felt that he should teach both theories of our existence, Darwin's evolution versus creation theory. He had studied both theories for about 20 years and couldn't prove either one. He thought his students should be exposed to both sides. The school board did not agree, and after a lengthy court battle without a jury trial, he was fired and barred from teaching in South Dakota. Due to the controversy he gained a lot of publicity and was invited to speak all over the country. During his stay in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, he was invited to attend a meeting sponsored by a group called Citizens for Constitutional Government. So that's where his family found out about all this stuff. At the meeting, he picked up a couple of books. One was When Our Money Fails. I should look that one up. That's by Mary Ralph. And the other was Miracle on Main Street by Toupee Saucy. There's kind of like a little bit of missing ink right there in her name. But look up Miracle on Main Street. In late May of 1981, the family was together at my sister's home in St. Paul, Minnesota. We were sitting around the kitchen table drinking coffee and visiting my brother Lloyd. He began telling us of the meeting he just attended in Sioux Falls. I looked these books over briefly and thought to myself that they sure made a lot of sense. 2 months later, I was resting after lunch and reading a beef magazine, which had an ad about management seminars to be held in August in Denver, in Colorado. I looked over the agenda closely and told Judy this might be a very beneficial conference to attend. I asked her to call them, ask a few questions, and see if there are any openings left. So later in the day, I stopped by the house to see what Judy had learned. She was really impressed with what they had to say, so she made me reservations. Even though we had gone to management seminars put on by the local county agents, we were never really satisfied with what they had given us, like the total picture. In August, we took our family vacation and attended the beef management seminar sponsored by Management Center for Agribusiness based in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Boom. At this management meeting, we studied, that's a little redundant, Colorado Springs, Colorado. At this meeting, we studied and discussed profit and losses, assets versus liabilities, and key expenses. We learned how to analyze our expenses by categorizing key expenses. In every operation, there are 2 or 3 expenses that comprise of 50% of the total operating expenses. This was the key to understanding the problem. That was becoming apparent throughout everyone's profit loss on their statements. So let me read that again. In every operation, there are 2 or 3 expenses that comprise 50% of the total operating expenses. All right, okay, that's key. The speaker from the Management Center gave us printouts of 7 different operations. These had detailed accounts of all the past 5 years. One constant held true: in all 7 cases, the farmers were all getting deeper and deeper into debt. In one case, the interest expense had gone from 7% of the total budget to over 59% of the operating expenses. Some of the farmers had acquired more assets, but not all of them. I told myself, there's something dreadfully wrong here. These people from the Management Center are supposed to be experts. They're supposed to be people who are going to teach us how to manage our money and our farms by getting a better hold on the accounting process. If they had all the answers, why weren't the farms and the managing that they were managing getting out of debt? Getting out of debt was the whole reason why I was there. And others were voicing the same concern. Their debt load was getting top heavy. So I had been selected as one of those outstanding procedures in my area, the local PCA office, from which I was borrowing my operating money. It had stated my wife and I were one of the biggest and most knowledgeable ranchers with which they had done business. In spite of all that, my expenses and low prices were pushing my operation into a financially unsound position. I could never understand why and how that could be, because most new wealth comes from the ground, and most of it through ranching or from farming the land one way or another. I spoke up and asked Roy Ferguson, the speaker at the session, "Roy, I don't understand why we're all getting deeper and deeper into debt. Chrysler Corporation has just gotten a big loan from the government to stay in business." Macy Ferguson was saying that they were getting a loan from the Canadian government to stay in business, and the government is about $1 trillion in debt. So, in $1 trillion, it is very obvious from the financial sheets in front of us that the farmers and ranchers are getting deeper and deeper into debt. And you know that the consumers can hardly make it go with big house payments and car payments added to all the other expenses. So, Roy, what I don't understand, if we're all going so deeply into debt, where is all the money coming from to keep financing us? It's all just funny money. They just print it, Roy replied. I came back with, okay, I accept that, but if that's true, then who gets the interest off the printing press? His answer, no one. Now, Roy, I prodded, I have been in business for 19 years, and I've yet to see a man who borrows and doesn't pay back the loan plus interest. All right? I mean, if we all borrow this money and it is just run off the press and we are paying interest on this borrowed money, then who does the rest of the interest off the printing press? Who gets... Let me read that again. If we all borrow this money, and this is key, and it is just run off the printing press and we're paying interest on this borrowed money, then who does get the interest off the printing press? It's hard to read who does get. Confronted with this question, he turned and looked off across the room and said to another man attending the meeting, "What was your questions?" He totally ignored me and my questions as if I had vanished into thin air. His reaction really made me think that there was certainly something wrong. So they're searching for all these unanswered questions. And it just began, basically, for them, just figuring out about all this tyranny that exists in our banking system. So, after returning home from a seminar, Judy and I thought that it would be a good idea to have our business analyzed by people from the management firm. However, we felt we couldn't afford $8,000 fee required to have them come to Timber Lake and do it. We thought that perhaps we could approach the PCA officers and get them to go through the program with us step by step, and then by doing so we would understand the process and then could use the procedure to help other borrowers. In order to approach them correctly, Judy spent many long, tedious hours during the next several months putting our records into the charts and statements. When it was all completed, we asked for special time with the PCA officers in Timber Lake. We were able to lay before them detailed accounting of all the money taken and spent in the previous 19 years. We described the seminar to them and how we would like to have the men from Denver, come out to our area and, using our records, teach us how to analyze our financial records. Then we could use that knowledge to help other farmers in the area that worked with PCA. When PCA officers to help we asked the PCA officers to help put up the $8,000, Mr. Holm was quite impressed and wanted to learn more. However, the senior officer, a Mr. Harrison, deflated our enthusiasm with one fell swoop. He said, "I realize you have done a tremendous amount of work, Judy. I have to admit, in all my years, I've never seen a set of records as complete as yours. But all the records do is tell you what has happened. It really doesn't make any difference what kind of records you have. If it rains, the crops will grow, and you have to get feed for the cattle, providing there are no other disasters such as hail, etc. Also, you have no control over price. So I can't see where getting someone in here to do and analyze your records will help you. Me or anyone else. I don't mean to discourage you in your record keeping, Judy, but I don't think it's all that big a deal. Shortly after we got home from the seminar, Judy and the boys moved into Mobridge so the boys could go to school. I stayed at the ranch and took care of things. At the time, we were running about 320 cows and feeding 400 calves plus 20 sows, finishing their piglets. Excuse me. I was all alone on the ranch, thinking about the meeting in Denver and the fact that the PCA would not help. I told Judy I want to know and understand everything they taught us in Denver. I want you to figure out exactly who our operation has done. I want you to tell us what our operation has done during the last 5 years. Sorry. I want to see everything just like they showed us in Denver. Every weekend I had asked her if she had done that yet, and she would say, "No, I don't know exactly how to do it. Why don't you help me out?" Well, I didn't know how to do it either. And then she finally went to Neil Cahill, a CPA in Mobridge. There was a man with him who did understand what we wanted to do. He helped Judy over the rough spots. We ordered a few more forms from the management center in Denver towards spring. Judy finally had it all done and laid out for me to see. During this same period, PCA had their annual meeting. Judy came to the ranch and we went to the meeting in Timberlake together. We went with hope of getting some answers to the questions that keep bothering me. Robert Sweeney, the vice president of the Federal Intermediate Credit Bank of Omaha, Nebraska, was the speaker. How does money get into circulation? After the meeting, I went up to the speaker and told him I enjoyed this speech, but had a few questions. And I told him I was beginning to handle a lot of money. And he had discovered I really didn't know much about money. Where does money come from? How does it get into circulation? What is the Federal Reserve's role? His reaction was startling. His face became beet red. He began to perspire profusely. He got so tongue-tied he could barely speak. It took him a few minutes to regain his composure and begin answering my question. So he told me to not even think about the Federal Reserve. Don't pay any attention to them, man, because almost all your money is created in demand deposits. What's a demand deposit, I asked. Well, that's your checking account. But I don't understand. My checking account always starts out with a big pile of borrowed money, then dwindles down to nothing. I sell everything I can produce for a year, and that just about pays it all back. Then I start off with what that much money I borrowed again. I start out with the same amount, usually plus 10 or 15% to cover inflation. So basically, it's just, let me just keep reading. He said, well, that's what I mean. Here, let me give you an example. If your grandmother gave you $100 from Germany, we would call that new money. If you put that in the bank, and the bank would be able to loan that out 90% of the original money, the first man to walk in the door, when that man signed the promissory note, promised to pay back, then the bank places that loan in the man's checking account. Although this guy still had it in his checking account and was spending it, the bank would consider this a new deposit and could lend out 90% of his promise to pay. In theory, they could keep lending a fraction until the $100 of the original deposit is in the amount of $900 worth of loans. And the bank still has the original $100. So I said I wasn't sure I could understand that all. Excuse me. Mr. Sweeney said he had to leave. But he said, send me a publication from the Federal Reserve System which would explain it in detail and very simply. The publication he sent was called Modern Money Mechanics. Okay, so later I discovered the Federal Reserve publication story of the banks. It explains in picture format how banks operate. In order to check the concept of fractional banking, I went to a computer expert in Timberlake. Starting with $100, retaining 10% and loaning it out 90%, the computer cranked out the numbers until it reached the mathematical limit. Mr. Sweeney was correct. $900 was the mathematical limit that could be loaned with 10% reserve. Thinking about that as a rancher, I put it in ranching terms. For example, if I had a cow and she had a calf, I could sell that calf 9 times and still have the calf to butcher and eat. I could have a full stomach all winter and my bills paid and have a good profit too. This added to my growing suspicion that something was very, very wrong here with our money system. All the procedures of wealth were steadily becoming overcome with debt. Things were not fair and equal. It couldn't be right that banks could accumulate $900 of their interest-bearing loans from a $100 deposit. The fraud is real. Now to understand how and why, I was to learn that the trouble is not so much what we use for money as it is how that money is brought into circulation. If we used a gold or silver coin for money, then pass a law saying that only a few could mine that gold or silver and mint it into coin, and that everyone else would then have to borrow that gold or silver coin to pay the interest on the coins, we would still have an unconstitutional, mathematically impossible, and immoral money system. A money system such as this would still deprive the people of their right to own property and our constitutional guarantees of life, liberty, and the right to own property. And the pursuit of happiness, that it was originally the right to own property. I began to think about all this and more, and came to the point that all I was doing was studying, taking notes, and discussing the matter of our money system with anyone who I could get it to discuss with me. When I was telling my brother Lloyd about my findings, he said, "Byron, you are definitely making sense, but in order to really get these people to understand it, you should write it all down. Get your thought organized." In writing it all down, I wanted to be able to back up my statements with documentation. I didn't think people would just accept my findings without it. After all, I didn't have a college education. I was a country boy who was catching on to the biggest fraud ever put on the American people. Okay, so banks create money out of nothing. I decided the most credible place to get the documentation was from the Department of Treasury. So I began writing to officials in the department. In my first letters, I asked them simply, what is the money and where does it come from? I have that book, actually. I lent it to a friend. I'm going to get that back and read that too. It has lots of illustrations in it. Their answer, the bank creates it out of nothing by simply making bookkeeping entries. Then they loan out $6 every one they have. Jeez. And thinking about their answer, I was puzzled because what they said was happening is rather hard to do. Let's take a situation where I give you an ounce of silver and you loan it out to the first man you see. The silver is gone, right? So how can it be loaned to the second, third, and up to 6 people? There's only one way that could be done, and that is by writing on a piece of paper. I loaned you 1 piece of silver. I owe you. Sorry. And then convince the guy you gave the paper to that note is the same thing as an actual piece of silver. Under this deceitful system, you would see that it's basically made up. You could get rich. You're probably wondering, how does this affect you and me in our everyday business? Well, when we were back in the barter system, or even using gold and silver coins, it was obvious we were trading wealth for wealth. When we started using paper, we actually went from a wealth money system to a debt money system. A promise to pay you later. This is reality. In reality, it's changed our money from moral money into immoral money. Debauchery is basically that term. We all must realize that there's big difference between I own and I owe. By going to paper, we went from a medium of exchange to a medium of theft. When we borrow all the money into circulation, as it is now done in our country, we will always have debt, and we will always have interest to pay. In whatever business you are in, as you expand and need more money to acquire property, you get deeper and deeper into your debt, and your interest bill gets greater and greater. Therefore, you must have a greater markup just to cover your fixed cost, for example. I mean, take a small county with 10 people, including a doctor, a lawyer, merchant, shoemaker, and farmer, etc. Every one of them, if they were all going to survive, is going to set his price of goods, of services, high enough to cover all of his costs and give him his needs. As each of our businesses expands, the debt will get greater and greater. So he will set his price high enough to pass the debt on to someone else, the customer. Our government operates on the same principle. As it gets deeper and deeper into debt, our government officials must impose more taxes in order to keep the deficit down. Since every business has more and more debt and taxes, the owners must receive more and more of their finished products, or pay less of the raw materials. But the farming community and all of its procedure of raw products are the farmer, the only ones who cannot set their price, especially the farmer. It is only natural that everyone tries to pass their debt load on down through the system until it finally settles into the farming community. Really, it does. When the farmer price is so low and the manufacturer's prices are so high that the farmer can no longer afford those products, the farmer fails. When a mass of farmers go under, we have a depression and possibly a complete financial collapse. Under the present debauched system, mathematically it takes about 50 years for a depression to develop. 50 years between major depressions. About that time, I was getting this all figured out in my mind, and I discovered the book called Truth in Money by Ted Theron, Thoren. I couldn't believe it. I had been dealing with reality the way a farmer and rancher thinks, and here was Ted Theron, a mathematical engineer, who had it all worked out. Every theory and formula was carefully worked out and proven that it was going on in the business world and applied to farming community as well. As I kept studying and gathering more information about our money system, I came to the conclusion that this isn't right. It can't go on. No matter how good I am at feeding cattle, raising hogs and crops, no matter how good we get at keeping records, eventually it will be for naught. The bubble is going to break, and we are going to lose everything, guys. I know I had to do something about it, but I didn't know what to do. One thing was for certain. I was determined not to go along with this fraud any longer. I had a note in the bank. If I went in now and signed another loan after knowing about the fraud, then I would just be as guilty as anybody, because I will be a willful participant in the fraud. But what could go on? What could one man do? How do we make this process expose this money system? So Fed notes are not legal negotiable instruments. About this point in time, I came upon a book, The Greatest Con, by Irwin Schiff. I'm sorry. It's Schiff. We wrote in depth about Federal Reserve notes and how they're not negotiable instruments. I started looking in to see the laws governing negotiable instruments and what they were. After studying these laws, I made out a certificate that I thought would comply with these laws, I took it into a lawyer in Mobridge. I laid it on the desk and asked him if this was a negotiable instrument according to the laws of the United States and the states of South Dakota. He studied it and answered yes. When I got home, I called a lawyer in Timberlake and asked him what the legal tender laws are here. Excuse me. He replied, anything that is not a negotiable instrument is legal tender in the state of South Dakota. I also called the Dewey County State's Attorney and asked him about a couple of federal laws, one of which was 31 U.S.C. 314, which states all money must be kept in accordance with 15, 5, and 21 grains of gold. I asked him, or 521 21 gram of gold, grains of gold. That's hard to look at there. I asked him if that law was still valid law, or if there had been any changes or revisions. He said he didn't know about that, and he would look it up and call me back. When he called back, he told me yes, it is valid in current law, but they were definitely not paying any attention to it. I asked him if we could talk to the Attorney General about it. His response was a firm no. I asked him why not. Wasn't that his job? But he didn't want to talk to me any longer after that. But he did send me a bill for $10. I called the Attorney General myself to see if he would enforce 31 U.S.C. 314. He simply informed me that he wouldn't give me any legal advice. I asked him for legal advice. I never asked him for legal advice. I simply wanted him to uphold the law. After considerably more study, I called my bankers and asked them to come out to my ranch for a discussion. Jim Harrison couldn't make it, but Jerry Holm did come. Judy and I sat down with Jerry and started from square one. We explained the entire situation to him. Jerry was very receptive and acknowledged there had to be a basis in what we were saying. That night, as Jerry was leaving, I told him that we didn't know what was going to happen, but there was one thing for sure. In all good conscience, we couldn't sign any more notes. We didn't want them to think we were going to do a single thing behind his back. I wanted everything up front. In the days following the meeting with the PCA agents, when they came to my home, I continued my studies. I began to research the Uniform Commercial Code and found in South Dakota codified laws 57A, 57A3, 101 states. Any writing to be a negotiable instrument within the chapter must be signed by the marker or drawer and b. contain an unconditional promise or order to pay a sum certain in money, and no other promise, order, obligation, or power given to the marker or drawer except as authorized by this chapter, and c. be payable on demand or at a definite time, and d. be payable to the order of the bearer. A writing which complies with the requirement of this section is D, a note. If it is a promise other than a certificate of deposit, okay, and then it says SDCL 57A 2304, price payable in money, goods, realty, and otherwise. Okay, so number one, the price can be made payable in money or otherwise if it is payable in whole or in part in goods each party is a seller of the goods which he is to transfer. SDCL 57A-2-503. Manner of seller's tender or of delivery, And then A, tender must be at a responsible hour. and if it is of goods, they must be kept available reasonably necessary to enable the buyer to take possession. So SDCL 57A-3-604, tender of payment. Where the maker of acceptor of instrument payable to, then on demand is able to ready a pay at every place of payment specified in the instrument when it is due. It is equivalent to tender. Black's Law Dictionary defines tender, an order of money tender through, usually used in connection with an offer to pay money, is properly used in connection with the offer of property other than money. SDCL 57A-3-107. Money. An instrument is payable in money if the medium of exchange in which it is payable is money at the time the instrument is made. An instrument payable in currency or current funds is payable in money. Of course, the current funds today are simply book entries. The decimal system, see 31 USC 5101. What I had discovered was a correct and lawful way to monetization of basic raw material or above parity. Full monetization of raw materials, thus becoming an interest-free, debt-free way of creating money. The Coulter Roy Wilkin parity approach that the American agricultural movement always talks of but never does anything about. After I discovered how I could, by following the laws of the United States of South Dakota, reinstate the parity approach, pay my bills, and stay in the ranching business, I took steps to do so. To better understand the parity approach, read The Unforgiven by Charles Walter, Jr. That's Acres, USA, P.O. Box 49. I'm not going to read that because I don't want to get any copyright stuff or anything. What I did discover, but didn't fully understand at the time, was that Section 16 of the Federal Reserve Act provided the people a way to monetize their assets and bring Federal Reserve notes into circulation without indebtedness to the banking system. The normal way for the Federal Reserve notes to get into circulation is for someone to go to the bank or depository institution and get a loan. The money is then created on the books of the bank as a debit to the loan account and credit to the borrower's checking account. There was kind of a typo there. Excuse me. So the loan account number would be $1,000. The checking account DDA or cash is $1,000. Simple. This procedure puts money into circulation as soon as the borrower writes a check on the checking account and spends some of the newly created bank credits. However, this procedure does not put any Federal Reserve notes into circulation. To put Federal Reserve notes into circulation, someone must take a check to the bank and cash it and get Federal Reserve notes. Then for the bank to get more Federal Reserve notes to replace those just given out, they must order them from the regional Federal Reserve Bank and pay for them dollar for dollar. If one thinks a little bit on this, it is clear that the local bank cannot pay for the replacement Fed notes, with Fed notes already in their possession. If you paid for $1 Fed note with $1 Fed note, you would never get more than what you had begin with. You have to pay for them with some other asset. So that's important, guys. You have to pay with some other asset. The Bureau of Printing and Engraving of the United States Treasury in Washington, D.C. prints out all of the Federal Reserve notes. No other bureau agency other than the Federal Reserve Bank, individual or private company, has this authority. With the 12 Federal Reserve banks, we need more Fed notes. They send an order to the controller of the currency, who, in turn, sends an order to the Bureau of Printing and Engraving to print the new notes. As an example, in 1987, the Fed banks ordered 6,569,000,000,000 notes. Jeez. Oh, man. The face value was 75 million billion. Okay, then the cost of each note is about 2.6 cents each. This covers the cost of materials. The denomination of the note is not a factor. To put this in perspective, it costs about $260 to print $10,100 notes. How would you like to be able to buy $1 million for $260? Oh, man, dude. Ugh. However, there is one other requirement Fed banks have to fulfill. To get the notes, they must also pledge collateral equal to the face value of notes. This collateral must consist of the following assets: a loan or in any combination. Gold certificates, number 1. Number 2, special drawing right certificates. Okay. Number 3, U.S. government securities. And number 4, eligible paper as described by the statute. Eligible paper must consist of notes, drafts, and a bill of exchange endorsed by a bank that is a member of the Federal Reserve banking system. There is another way to bring the Federal Reserve note into circulation. You can either go through the Federal Reserve described above or simply issue a note or a draft on farm production and tender it to the bank. The bank can endorse it and send it through the system. Until it is held in the Treasury for collateral for the issuance of Federal Reserve notes. This puts Fed notes into circulation without incurring interest-bearing debts at the bank. As I stated earlier, I did not understand this back in 1982 as fully as I do now. In fact, on October 25th, 1991, I had personal conversation with Wayne D. Engel, who is currently serving on the Board of Governors at the Federal Reserve System. He admitted that yes, under the Federal Reserve Act, what I just stated about bringing Fed notes into circulation without incurring interest-bearing debts to the bank could be done, and in fact was done until about 1923. It was called the Real Bill Doctrine. Although it could be done under the law, the Fed would not allow it because if they did, they would not be able to control the money supply. This is what they do: control the money. To make use of our newfound information, Judy called Northwest PCA office, the Federal Land Bank office, and the FMHA office, and asked them how much we owed if we came in that day and paid off the entire note. After getting this amount, we filled in our certificates, which are legal negotiable instruments. We made them for the amount payable to at our ranch in hay at 99 cents per pound and silage at 60 cents per pound, and sent them to the agencies. We'd always been at the management meeting in order to be a good manager. You have to learn to merchandise your product. Obviously, everyone else in the U.S. sets their prices to cover costs, except farmers and ranchers. We reasoned that if we can't set our price, then we must be victims of a civil rights violation against minorities. So we set our price and set the commodity drafts, which would be much like PIK certificates, to these 3 lending institutions. So I began trying for years to get the PCA to come out and look at these things and see if we could be doing things any better. They never were interested. Now all of a sudden, they were at my front door wanting to count my cows and look at everything I had. I told them that I didn't want them on my place anymore and that I didn't owe them anything. As far as I was concerned, they were trespassing. They had been paid in full, legally, lawfully, and correctly. If they didn't believe me, I showed them all the laws. They said they didn't care what the laws said. Boy, how right that turned out to be. Dude, 2 weeks later, the sheriff drove into our yard and served us with an assortment of papers. Among these were a summons to appear in the Circuit Court, 8th District, in McIntosh, South Dakota. On October 27th, 1982, the sheriff served the papers on October 22nd, which was a Friday. The court date was for the following Tuesday. Since the date of service was not count. Since the date was for the following Tuesday, since the date service does not count, and the following 2 days were a weekend, this left us with only 1 day to prepare for the hearing. I had talked to an attorney from the Huron named Frank Schluter. It's hard to pronounce that name. He had agreed to help us if the time came. I called him immediately, but he said he was booked for Tuesday with another case and he wouldn't be able to make it to Corson County that day. He advised us to appear in the court and explain to the judge the situation, and we would be able to get a continuance until he could appear with us. We had his calendar in order to negotiate a new hearing date. Just to be on the safe side, we thought maybe we should have something to file, so we sat down and wrote a brief challenging to the jurisdiction and setting forth the theory of the case. We had help from a man named Mike Phillips, who we thought was a friend. It turned out that he was a federal agent working on the case that framed and killed Gordon Kahl, K-A-H-L. Surprises in the Chitter's Court. I thought it was Cheshire for a second. On October 27th, we went to the courtroom, but the doors were locked. We waited until the judge let us in. When we came to the doors, we were asked who we were. We told him that we were Byron and Judy Dale. He replied, "Oh, that's right, the PCA foreclosure action. Come on in, we're ready." Hey, the papers they had served us said nothing about foreclosure action. This was the first time I had ever heard of someone being foreclosed on because they had tried to pay off their debt. We advised the court of our situation, reminding them of the statutes governing the service and questioned their jurisdiction. We also requested an extension of time until we could meet with the attorney. Judge Chetter said the Dales are here. PCA is here. We will proceed. In his opening remarks, PCA's attorney Ron Johnson stated that there was probably a breach of contract and he wanted a relief granted in two ways. First, he wanted the court to make a determination that the PCA could not be bound by their contract. And second, the court would put a restraint on us so that we couldn't sell anything. At this time, he also requested that the court to give the PCA permission to come onto our place and count the cattle with the stipulation that Sheriff Kettleson and I be present. Finally, I was given the chance to speak. I told them I was there under special appearance, that this court didn't have any jurisdiction over me, and I was challenging their jurisdiction. I made a motion for dismissal on such grounds. Then I submitted the brief we had prepared. The judge answered on this basis of his memorandum discussion of in the Felt versus First National Bank case, saying he did have jurisdiction to hear the case. I told him I didn't believe he could do that because he didn't even read my briefs, and my case wasn't even similar to the Felt case. I stated he had to read my brief and rule on my case on its own merits. Judge Chetter said, "I deny your motion." I confronted him with, "You cannot do that. I have the right to be heard in court." "Definitely," Chetter said. "This is my court, and I can do as I please." To this I challenged, "This is not your court. It is the people's court." Chetter promptly ordered me to sit down. I defied his order, saying, "I am not going to sit down. You are denying me my right to be heard, my right to submit a motion, and you haven't even read my brief on it yet." The judge insisted he had read the brief. I reminded him he had not. Realizing I wasn't going to back down, He said, "Very well. I'm going to take a recess and I'll read the brief again, and I'll come back in. If I feel it necessary, I will vacate my previous order and re-enter a new one." About the judge reading my brief, I need to make a special note. According to the transcripts quoted above, the judge stated twice that he had read the brief. This is a totally false statement because the brief didn't exist until the night before the hearing. Even then, he didn't see it until we handed it to him after the hearing had already started. After a short recess, the hearing resumed and things went from bad to worse. Judge Chetter moved the right on and made his decision. He ruled that PCA could go out and count cattle and look over my place. Chetter also advised us if we didn't like his decisions, we could appeal them and request to stop the counting until the appeal was heard. Excuse me. After the hearing, my wife and I were in a state of shock and exhausted. Judy said she felt like she had been run over by a semi-truck. We had thought that when we told the judge about the shortness of notice and having no legal counsel present there, that he would be fair and open-minded and act as an impartial referee, allowing us time for an attorney and to be there to help us. This wasn't anything like the courtroom scene we had envisioned. Boy, we were misled. After all out studying and acting out of good conscience, believing we had tendered payment in full, with the courts to hear our case and adjudicate this question, we had found out in one short hearing that the courts were there to protect the bankers. Whatever Ron Johnson said, he wanted the judge to say, "Yes, sir." And that's the way he ruled. You drove back to Mobridge, Mike Phillips and I. We drove back to Mobridge. Mike Phillips and I